August 19, 1969, the day after Woodstock ended, while 500,000 people were still recovering from 3 days of peace, love, and music in upstate New York, Miles Davis walked into Columbia's Studio B in Manhattan with a plan that would make Woodstock look conservative. He assembled 13 musicians, not his usual quintet. 13? 3 electric pianos, 2 basses, 3 drummers, a bass clarinet, electric guitar, and Miles himself standing in the center, ready to blow his trumpet through effects never heard on a jazz record. The sessions lasted 3 days, 10 in the morning to 1 in the afternoon. No sheet music, no rehearsed arrangements, just Miles snapping his fingers, whispering instructions, and telling musicians when to solo by calling out their names in that raspy voice that could command and terrify in equal measure. 9 months later, a double album arrived with a title that made radio programmers uncomfortable, and a cover painting so psychedelic it looked like it belonged on a Santana record. Bitches Brew. Jazz purists called Miles a sellout, a traitor. Critics called it commercial crap. Columbia Records didn't know how to market it. But college kids who loved Jimi Hendrix and Sly Stone heard something different. They heard the future. And they bought it in numbers no jazz album had ever seen. By 1976, Bitches Brew was certified gold, Miles Davis's first. It peaked at number 35 on the Billboard 200, unheard of for jazz. It won a Grammy, and more importantly, it launched Weather Report, Return to Forever, and the Mahavishnu Orchestra, 3 bands that would define the next decade of music. But the real story of Bitches Brew isn't about its commercial success or its cultural impact. It's about an artist at a crossroads, refusing to become a memory. It's about 13 musicians creating something none of them fully understood. And it's about the price jazz paid, and gained, when its most important voice plugged in and never looked back. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is the story of the album that killed jazz and brought it back to life. By the summer of 1969, Miles Davis had a problem. He was 43 years old, a legend. The man who had pioneered cool jazz with Birth of the Cool, the genius behind Kind of Blue, still the best-selling jazz album of all time. A musician who had changed the direction of jazz more than anyone except maybe Louis Armstrong or Charlie Parker. And jazz was dying. Not slowly, not gracefully. Dying the way a candle dies when someone blows it out. Sudden and complete. The clubs that had packed audiences in the 1950s were closing. The record sales that had sustained careers were evaporating. Young people weren't listening to jazz anymore. They were listening to rock. To Hendrix setting his guitar on fire at Monterey. To Sly Stone bringing funk and soul together at Woodstock. To James Brown making people move in ways jazz never could. Miles watched it happen with growing frustration. He'd see arena-sized crowds gathering for rock bands, while jazz musicians played to half-empty rooms. He'd watch Columbia Records throw money at Blood, Sweat, and Tears in Chicago, bands borrowing heavily from jazz. While his own albums sold in the mid-5 figures, not enough to recoup what the label had advanced him. He was in debt to Columbia. Considerable debt. And label president Clive Davis was getting nervous about advancing more money to an artist whose commercial prospects looked increasingly dim. But Miles had something neither Clive Davis nor the jazz critics understood. He had Betty Mabry. His young girlfriend, 23 years old to his 43, was introducing him to a world of music he'd dismissed. She took him to see Jimi Hendrix at the Fillmore. She played him Sly and the Family Stone records. She talked about James Brown and funkadelic grooves and what young black audiences actually wanted to hear. And Miles listened. He later admitted it in his autobiography with characteristic bluntness. 1969 was the year rock and funk were selling like hotcakes, and jazz seemed to be withering on the vine. I wasn't prepared to be a memory yet. By early 1969, Miles had already started experimenting. His album, In a Silent Way, recorded in February and released in July, featured electric pianos and guitars. It was atmospheric, dreamy, almost ambient, a radical departure from traditional jazz but still relatively tame. Critics called it space music. It was beautiful, it was innovative, but it wasn't enough. Miles knew In a Silent Way was just a prelude. He'd seen what happened at Woodstock in August. 500,000 people celebrating a new kind of music that fused everything together without caring about genre boundaries. He'd been touring with his band throughout the spring and summer, introducing new pieces that were harder, funkier, more aggressive than anything he'd recorded. Songs with names like Miles Runs the Voodoo Down and Spanish Key. His core working band had stabilized around Wayne Shorter on soprano saxophone, Chick Corea on electric piano, Dave Holland on bass, and Jack DeJohnette on drums. They were young, they were hungry, they were open to anything, and Miles had a vision. Not a gentle, atmospheric album like In a Silent Way, something bigger, darker, more chaotic, something that would force the music industry to pay attention, something that would bring young audiences back to jazz, even if it meant old jazz fans would abandon him. He booked Columbia Studio B for 3 days in August. He invited more musicians than he'd ever recorded with at once. He asked his producer, Teo Macero, to record everything, not just the takes, but the whole sessions, start to finish. Every false start, every experiment, everything. And he told Clive Davis the album would sell. Clive Davis was skeptical, but Miles was insistent. In that raspy, low voice that conveyed heat over the telephone while you strained to hear every word, Miles made it clear. This album would change everything. He just had to make it first. Miles Davis didn't draw up blueprints. He didn't write charts. He didn't explain his vision in words that made sense to anyone but himself. But he knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted the hypnotic grooves of Sly and the Family Stone, the electric intensity of Hendrix, the polyrhythmic complexity of African music, the modal freedom of his own kind of blue, and the raw, unfiltered energy of a jam session at Minton's Playhouse in the bebop days, when musicians pushed each other into unknown territory just to see what would happen. He wanted all of that in one sound, one album, one massive statement that would be impossible to ignore. Producer Teo Macero had been working with Miles since 1958. They'd made Kind of Blue together. They'd been through every major shift in Miles's career, and Macero understood something crucial about Miles. The genius wasn't always in the performance. It was in what you did with the performance afterward. Macero had pioneered the use of tape editing in jazz. On In a Silent Way, he'd spliced takes together, looped sections, created compositions in the editing room that didn't exist in the studio. It was controversial. Some jazz purists thought editing was cheating, that jazz had to be captured live and whole. But Miles trusted Macero completely. He gave him carte blanche to manipulate the tapes however he wanted. For Bitches Brew, Miles wanted to go even further. He wanted long-form pieces, 20-25 minutes long. Not traditional songs with verses and choruses, improvised suites that ebbed and flowed like Indian ragas or symphonic movements. He wanted the studio itself to be an instrument, with reverb and echo and tape effects woven into the fabric of the music. And he wanted a specific sound from his musicians. Joe Zawinul, the Austrian keyboardist who'd written the title track for In a Silent Way, brought a compositional sensibility Miles loved. Chick Corea had been with Miles for 2 years and understood the language. John McLaughlin, the British guitarist who'd been in the United States less than 2 weeks before Miles called him for In a Silent Way, brought a rock sensibility filtered through jazz sophistication. For Bitches Brew, Miles brought them all back. But he added more. Lenny White, a 19-year-old drummer. Harvey Brooks, an electric bassist with virtually no jazz experience but years in rock and pop. Benny Maupin on bass clarinet, adding a dark, woody texture. Don Alias, Juma Santos, Billy Cobham, percussionists who could layer African and Latin rhythms over the top of everything. Drummer Jack DeJohnette was crucial. His predecessor Tony Williams had left the group, and DeJohnette brought something different, a propulsive, rock-influenced energy that could anchor the chaos Miles was about to unleash. Miles set them up in a half circle, himself and Wayne Shorter in the middle. Everyone else arranged around them like an orchestra. Headphones on. No guests allowed. except Max Roach, the legendary bebop drummer, who slipped in unannounced and watched in silence, and Miles gave them almost nothing to work with. A tempo count, a few chords, a hint of melody, a mood. "Keep it tight," he'd say, snapping his fingers. "John," he'd whisper, cueing McLaughlin to solo. The musicians would have to listen intensely to each other, react, create in real time. Miles believed this approach forced better music. It kept everyone alert, present, responding to what was happening in the moment rather than following a script. It was jazz at its core, improvisation, collective creation, but it was also something new, because Miles wasn't just letting them play. He was conducting, shaping, building something that wouldn't be fully realized until Macero spliced it all together months later. The vision was clear in Miles's mind. Whether it would work was another question entirely. August 19th, 1969, 10 in the morning. The musicians arrived at Columbia's Studio B not entirely sure what they were about to record. Some had rehearsed one track the night before, Bitches Brew, the title piece. Others were walking into the session completely cold. 19-year-old Lenny White was terrified. "I was in awe," he later admitted. "I was afraid of Miles." But Miles was cool with him, encouraging, making the young drummer feel like he belonged. The band started with Bitches Brew itself, nearly 27 minutes of music that would require 19 edits before Macero was done with it. The musicians played in sections, building layers, Miles giving minimal direction. On the quieter passages you can hear his voice on the final recording, snapping fingers, telling them to keep it tight. No overdubs. Everything was recorded live. The tape machine ran the entire time. Macero's revolutionary approach. He'd record 3 hours of material, then take it back to the editing room and listen for pieces that fit together. "This is a good little piece here. This matches with that," he'd say, scissors and tape in hand, constructing the final compositions like a sculptor working clay. The session moved through John McLaughlin, a 4-minute piece where Miles didn't even play. Just let the guitarist explore. Then Sanctuary, a Wayne Shorter composition they'd been playing live all summer. By the end of the first day, they'd also rehearsed Pharaoh's Dance, the opening track that would eventually span over 20 minutes and feature some of Miles's most aggressive trumpet playing on record. Day 2. August 20th. More tracks, more experiments. Miles was playing differently than anyone had heard him play before. Not the cool melodic improviser of Kind of Blue. This was fierce, explosive, venturing into the upper register of the trumpet with fast runs and aggressive attacks. His closing solo on Miles Runs the Voodoo Down was particularly striking, raw, primal, unlike anything in his catalog. The musicians were creating something they couldn't fully comprehend. Joe Zawinul later told a story about being in Columbia Records offices months after the sessions. A secretary was playing incredible music he didn't recognize. "Who the hell is that?" he asked. She answered, "It's the Miles Davis Bitches Brew thing." Zawinul was stunned. "Damn, is that great," he thought, unable to connect it to the confusing sessions he'd participated in. Day 3. August 21st. The biggest ensemble yet. On some tracks, 11 people in the rhythm section alone. 3 keyboardists, electric guitar, 2 basses, 4 drummers and percussionists, and bass clarinet. Miles had pulled out all the stops searching for a heavier bottom end. Harvey Brooks, the rock bassist, brought a different energy entirely. John McLaughlin's guitar cut through the density like lightning. The multiple drummers created polyrhythms that felt African, Latin, and rock influenced all at once. It was like a big pot and Miles was the sorcerer, Lenny White remembered. He was hanging over it saying, "I'm going to add a dash of Jack DeJohnette and a little bit of John McLaughlin, and then I'm going to add a pinch of Lenny White, and here's a teaspoonful of Benny Maupin playing the bass clarinet." He made that work. He got the people together who he thought would make an interesting combination. It was a big, controlled experiment, and Miles had a vision that came true. When the sessions ended, Miles had about 9 hours of tape. Raw material, formless, chaotic, brilliant, confusing. It would take Macero and engineer Ray Moore over a month to shape it into an album. They spliced, they looped, they added reverb chambers and echo effects. They moved sections around, front to back to front, middle somewhere else. On Pharaoh's Dance alone, 19 edits. The studio became as much an instrument as the trumpet or guitar. What emerged was unlike anything jazz had produced, or rock, or funk. It was its own thing. Hypnotic grooves that could last 25 minutes. Sudden tempo changes. Dense layers of sound where you couldn't always tell who was playing what. Music that felt like it was building towards something, falling apart, building again. Miles called the musicians he assembled the greatest rock band of all time. He was being provocative, deliberately confusing genre classifications. But he was also making a point. This was music for young people who'd grown up on rock and funk, not their parents who remembered big band swing. And when Macero finally finished the editing, Miles approved the result. They had 6 tracks. They'd fill a double album, Miles's first. It would be expensive to produce, risky to market, impossible to categorize. Columbia Records had no idea what to do with it. The title caused problems immediately. In November 1969, producer Teo Macero sent a memo to a Columbia Records executive. Miles just called and said he wants this album to be titled Bitches Brew. Please advise. The word bitches wasn't something you put on album covers in 1970. Radio stations wouldn't play it. Stores might refuse to stock it, but Miles insisted. The absence of an apostrophe was deliberate. Brew was a verb, not a noun. The bitches were brewing something. The title was provocative, confrontational, deliberate. Columbia ultimately agreed, but nervously. Then there was the cover art. Miles commissioned German painter Matti Klarwein to create something visual equivalent to the music. Klarwein delivered a surreal psychedelic painting, a naked black couple gazing at an ocean. A huge vibrant red flower beside them, colors swirling in Afro-futurist fantasy. It was beautiful, it was bold, it looked nothing like a jazz album cover. Columbia approved it. They were committed now, for better or worse. But the real struggle was internal. Miles himself was battling demons that would plague him for years. His health was deteriorating, chronic pain, substance abuse issues, a lifestyle that burned bright and burned out. The electric period he was entering would eventually consume him, leading to increasingly erratic behavior and a 7-year retirement starting in 1974. And there was the creative struggle. The question of authorship and credit that would echo throughout Miles's career. In his autobiography, he addressed it directly. Some people have written that doing Bitches Brew was Teo Macero's or Clive Davis's idea. That's a lie, because they didn't have nothing to do with none of it. Miles was sensitive about credit. He'd spent his career watching white artists get acclaim for innovations black musicians pioneered. In a 1973 interview he said, "As long as I've been playing, they never say I'd done anything. They always say that some white guy did it." The tension between Miles's vision and Macero's editing would simmer for years. How much of Bitches Brew was Miles's genius? How much was Macero's studio wizardry? The truth, like most collaborative art, was impossible to untangle cleanly. Both men were essential, but only one name was on the cover. There was also the financial pressure. Miles was deeply in debt to Columbia. Clive Davis had taken a risk greenlighting a double album from an artist whose recent sales hadn't justified the investment. If Bitches Brew flopped, Miles's career might be over, at least at Columbia, at least as a major label artist. Miles had told Clive it would sell like hotcakes. But he couldn't be sure. No one could. The album was too strange, too long, too everything. And then there was the fear, unspoken but real, that he was alienating the very audience that had supported him for 20 years. Jazz fans, critics, musicians who revered him. He knew what was coming. the accusations of selling out, the claims he'd betrayed jazz. In the studio, he'd been confident, in control. But between the sessions in August and the release the following March, the doubt must have crept in. Was he doing the right thing? Or was he destroying his own legacy? There was no turning back now. The album was finished, the title was locked, the cover was printed. All that remained was to see if the world was ready for what Miles Davis had brewed. March 30th, 1970. Bitches Brew hit record stores as a double LP in a gatefold sleeve. Columbia's marketing department, still uncertain how to position it, hedged their bets. They promoted it to jazz audiences but also sent copies to rock radio stations. They pitched it to the underground FM stations that played album tracks, not just singles. The initial critical response was mixed, leaning toward confused. Jazz critics didn't know what to make of it. Some praised its ambition. Langdon Winner in Rolling Stone called it so rich in form and substance that it permits and even encourages soaring flights of imagination by anyone who listens. He concluded it would reward in direct proportion to the depth of your own involvement. But others heard betrayal. Bob Rush, a respected jazz critic and producer, was scathing. This to me was not great black music, but I cynically saw it as part and parcel of the commercial crap that was beginning to choke and bastardize the catalogs of such dependable companies as Blue Note and Prestige. The word sellout appeared in multiple reviews. Miles was accused of pandering to young white rock audiences, of abandoning the jazz tradition, of choosing commercial success over artistic integrity. Trumpeter and bebop pioneer Dizzy Gillespie, Miles's hero, listened with befuddlement. But Gillespie had faith. The guy is such a fantastic musician that I know he has something in mind, whatever it is. I know he knows what he's doing, so he must be doing something that I can't get to yet. Rock critics were equally perplexed. It wasn't quite rock. The structures were too loose, too improvised. Donald Fagen of Steely Dan later dismissed it. Essentially just a big trash out for Miles. To me, it was just silly and out of tune and bad. But something unexpected happened. College kids started buying it. Not jazz fans necessarily. Kids who loved Hendrix and Sly Stone and progressive rock. Kids who smoked pot and listened to entire album sides without skipping tracks. Kids who wanted music that took them somewhere. Within 4 months, Bitches Brew peaked at number 35 on the Billboard 200, the highest any Miles Davis album had ever charted on the all-genre chart. It sold over 100,000 copies in its first year, an unheard-of number for a jazz musician. Underground rock stations played it. Progressive FM DJs championed it. It crossed over in ways no purely jazz album had ever crossed over before. Columbia Records executives watched in amazement. Vernon Slaughter, director of progressive jazz music marketing at Columbia, later told Rolling Stone, "We found that the young audience that accounted for the rock success of the 60s has kept its buying habits in the 1970s. By December 1970, Bitches Brew won Downbeat magazine's Jazz Album of the Year in their annual Readers' Poll. The same publication that had published harsh reviews now had readers voting it the best jazz album of the year. And in 1971, the Grammys gave it the award for Best Large Jazz Ensemble Album. The mainstream music industry, always late to the party, had caught up. But perhaps the most telling response came from the musicians who'd played on it. They started forming their own bands. Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul formed Weather Report. Chick Corea started Return to Forever. John McLaughlin created the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Each would become legendary in their own right. Bitches Brew wasn't just an album, it was a launching pad, a permission slip. Proof that you could fuse jazz with rock and funk and electronics and create something viable, something audiences would embrace. Miles had proven his point. Jazz wasn't dead. It had just been waiting for someone brave enough, or reckless enough, to drag it kicking and screaming into the 1970s. The numbers tell part of the story. In 1976, 6 years after its release, Bitches Brew was certified gold by the RIAA, Miles Davis's first. It eventually sold over 1 million copies, earning platinum status. For a double album of experimental jazz rock fusion, this was unprecedented. But the real impact wasn't in sales, it was in what came after. Bitches Brew didn't just create a new sound, it created a new genre. Jazz fusion exploded in the 1970s, and almost every major fusion band could trace its lineage directly to the musicians who played on Miles's sessions. Weather Report, founded by Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul in 1970, took the atmospheric elements of Bitches Brew and refined them into commercially viable compositions. Their 1977 album Heavy Weather reached number 30 on the Billboard pop charts and won virtually every Jazz Album of the Year award in existence. Return to Forever, led by Chick Corea and featuring Bitches Brew drummer Lenny White, fused Latin influences with rock energy. Their 1976 album Romantic Warrior was a progressive rock masterpiece that happened to be played by jazz musicians. Mahavishnu Orchestra, fronted by John McLaughlin, took the electric guitar intensity of Bitches Brew to stratospheric heights. McLaughlin remembered Miles telling him after a 1970 gig, "It's time you formed your own band, John. I had to do it, if just to justify his belief in me." But the impact went beyond fusion. Herbie Hancock, who'd played on In a Silent Way, but not Bitches Brew, was inspired to create Headhunters in 1973. Jazz's first gold album, combining funk and danceable rhythms with jazz sensibility. George Benson's 1976 album Breezin' sold 4 million copies by 1980, proving fusion could be genuinely commercial. The album influenced rock artists too. Santana's Caravanserai, released in 1972, showed clear Bitches Brew DNA. Radiohead's Thom Yorke cited it as an influence on their 1997 album OK Computer, explaining, "It was building something up and watching it fall apart. That's the beauty of it. It was at the core of what we were trying to do." Hip-hop artists sampled it. R&B artists absorbed its grooves. Jazz musicians who initially rejected it eventually came around. Tom Hull, who became a jazz critic, remembered, "Back in the early 70s, we used to listen to Bitches Brew as late-night chill-out music, about the only jazz I ran into at the time." The album opened the eyes of music industry executives to the sales potential of jazz-oriented music. It proved that jazz didn't have to be commercially dead, that young audiences would embrace sophisticated music if it spoke their language. And it changed Miles himself. After Bitches Brew, he never went back. The rest of his 1970s output pushed even further. Live Evil, On the Corner, albums that made Bitches Brew sound tame by comparison. He transformed from Italian suits and ties to leather pants and psychedelic shirts, from playing acoustic clubs to filling rock arenas. He became Electric Miles, a different artist entirely, one who polarized audiences but could never be ignored. The album even transformed how we thought about recorded music. Teo Macero's editing techniques, using the studio as an instrument, splicing takes together, adding effects, became standard practice. Today, every hip-hop album, every electronic album, every pop album uses these techniques without thinking about it. But in 1970, it was revolutionary. Bitches Brew proved that jazz could evolve, that it didn't have to remain frozen in the 1950s. That the tradition wasn't a straitjacket but a foundation to build upon. Not everyone appreciated this lesson, but history did. The accusations of selling out never fully disappeared. Stanley Crouch, the conservative critic, wrote scathingly about Miles's fusion period in his essay On the Corner, The Sellout of Miles Davis, later anthologized in multiple books. Crouch argued that Bitches Brew didn't fit within the jazz tradition or a larger Black American musical tradition, that Miles had abandoned artistic integrity for commercial success. The debate became racial. Some critics suggested Miles was pandering to young white audiences instead of speaking to Black communities. Others countered that Miles was defining the Black aesthetic for a new generation, rejecting white artistic sensibilities and creating art that spoke to contemporary Black American needs. Cultural critic Greg Tate defended Miles fiercely. The funny thing is that as disorienting as that period was for his old fans, Miles stepped into the era of Black power politics and hippie rebellion like he'd had a hand in creating it all along. He never seemed like the old jazz hand who was trying to get hip to the youth and soul movements of the day. Homeboy came off like he was redefining cool for that generation too. The controversy extended to questions of authorship. How much of Bitches Brew was Miles's vision? How much was Macero's editing? How much emerged from the collective improvisation of the musicians? Miles was adamant in his autobiography. The album was his idea, his vision, his creation. But musicians like Joe Zawinul claimed they weren't properly credited for their contributions. The tension between individual genius and collaborative creation, a fundamental issue in jazz, became particularly acute with an album so heavily edited. There were also those who felt betrayed on artistic grounds. Jazz musicians who'd revered Miles watched him embrace rock audiences and felt abandoned. As Christian McBride explained decades later, a lot of people felt that he was an artistic traitor. But I think that there were a number of college kids who were listening to progressive rock and soul music who absolutely loved this record. The controversy even affected how other musicians approached fusion. Some embraced it, others rejected it violently, seeing it as jazz's death rather than its evolution. The genre fragmented into camps: traditionalists versus innovators, acoustic purists versus electric experimentalists. And there was a personal cost for Miles. The lifestyle that came with his electric period, drugs, erratic behavior, physical decline, took its toll. By 1975, he was in bad shape: chronic pain, substance abuse. By 1976, he'd essentially retire from music for 5 years, not returning until 1981. The intensity of Bitches Brew, both its creation and its aftermath, burned bright and burned fast. It was the peak of something, but also the beginning of a decline. Even the album's commercial success became controversial. Jazz purists pointed to it as proof that the music industry had corrupted jazz. That sales numbers now mattered more than artistic integrity. That Miles had opened a door that should have stayed closed. 40 years later, the debates continue. Was Bitches Brew Miles's greatest achievement or his greatest betrayal? Did it save jazz or kill it? Did it expand the tradition or abandon it? The answer, frustratingly and beautifully, is yes, to all of it. In 1999, 28 years after its release, Bitches Brew was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. The same institution that had given it an award in 1971 now recognized it as a historical treasure. In 2025, it was added to the National Recording Registry at the Library of Congress, joining the most culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant recordings in American history. The album that divided critics, confused audiences, and made jazz purists rage is now considered one of the greatest albums ever made in any genre. Rolling Stone ranks it among their 500 greatest albums of all time. Every major music publication includes it in their essential listening lists. More importantly, it remains current. Not in a respect your elders way. Actually current. Kamasi Washington's recent album covers show clear Afrofuturist influence from Mati Clarvain's art. Modern jazz musicians cite it as a touchstone. Hip-hop producers sample it. Young listeners discovering jazz often start here, not with Kind of Blue. Because Bitches Brew still sounds like the future. 55 years later, it hasn't dated the way most fusion did. Those hypnotic grooves, those dense layers of sound, that refusal to resolve into easy categorization, it all feels contemporary in a way that's almost eerie. Experimental jazz drummer Bobby Previght explained it perfectly. How much groundbreaking music do you hear now? It was music that you had that feeling you never heard quite before. It came from another place. How much music do you hear now like that? The answer is, not much. Even today, Bitches Brew occupies its own space. Not quite jazz, not quite rock, not quite funk. Its own thing, as singular in 2025 as it was in 1970. And its influence is everywhere. Every time a jazz musician picks up an electric instrument. Every time a producer splices takes together in the editing room. Every time an artist refuses to be confined by genre. Every time fusion bands take the stage. Every time someone says, "This doesn't sound like anything I've heard before." That's Bitches Brew. The album launched careers. Weather Report sold millions of records, returned to forever packed arenas. Mahavishnu Orchestra redefined what the electric guitar could do in a jazz context. Herbie Hancock's Headhunters proved fusion could be commercially massive. All of them trace their lineage back to those 3 days in August 1969. But perhaps the most important legacy is permission. Bitches Brew gave an entire generation of musicians permission to experiment, to cross boundaries, to ignore the purists, to trust that audiences were smarter and more open than the gatekeepers believed. Miles showed that you could honor a tradition by transforming it. That evolution wasn't betrayal. That jazz wasn't a museum piece to be preserved in amber, but a living, breathing art form that could absorb anything and make it new. The original Bitches Brew painting by Matti Klarwein. Lost. Miles tried to buy it back in the 1980s and couldn't find it. The location remains unknown, but the image remains iconic, reproduced thousands of times, instantly recognizable. Like the music itself, the art transcended its physical form. It became an idea, a symbol, a statement about what art could be when it refused to stay in its lane. And that, ultimately, is the legacy. Not the Grammy, not the platinum certification, not even the brilliant albums it inspired. The legacy is the idea that rules are meant to be broken, that genius doesn't ask permission, that the most important thing an artist can do is risk everything to create something nobody asked for. Miles Davis did that. And music has never been the same. 3 days in August, 13 musicians, 9 hours of tape. From that came an album that nobody wanted, nobody understood, and everybody eventually needed. Bitches Brew is the sound of an artist refusing to become a memory. It's the sound of jazz at a crossroads, choosing evolution over preservation. It's the sound of musicians creating something they couldn't fully comprehend, trusting the process even when the destination was unclear. It's also the sound of controversy. The accusations, the debates, the very real question of whether Miles Davis saved jazz or killed it. Both sides have compelling arguments. Both sides are probably right. Because Bitches Brew didn't save jazz. It didn't kill jazz. It did something more important. It reminded everyone that jazz was never meant to be safe. That the tradition Miles supposedly betrayed was itself built on rebellion. Charlie Parker destroying swing to create bebop. John Coltrane pushing modal jazz until it screamed. Ornette Coleman throwing out chord changes entirely. Miles was doing what jazz had always done. He was burning it down to see what would rise from the ashes. And what rose was fusion. Weather Report. Return to Forever. Mahavishnu Orchestra. Herbie Hancock's Headhunters. Steely Dan. A Tribe Called Quest. Radiohead. Kamasi Washington. Every artist who ever plugged in an instrument and refused to choose between jazz and everything else. The album sold 1 million copies. It won a Grammy. It changed the careers of everyone who played on it. But those aren't the reasons it matters. It matters because 55 years later, it still sounds like nothing else. Because it proved that audiences were ready for challenging music if you gave them something worth the challenge. Because it showed that the studio could be an instrument, that editing could be composition, that collaboration could be authorship. Most of all, it matters because Miles Davis, at 43 years old, with everything to lose, decided he wasn't done yet, decided he had more to say, decided that being a legend wasn't enough if you weren't still creating. That 8-month pregnant woman lying on a studio floor at 3 a.m.? Wrong story. That was Lauryn Hill. For Miles, it was standing in a studio in Manhattan, trumpet in hand, watching 13 musicians create chaos on his command. It was trusting Teo Macero to find the music in 9 hours of tape. It was putting a word on an album cover that radio wouldn't play and defending that choice without apology. It was being brave enough to risk your legacy for the chance to create something that mattered. And that's what Bitches Brew is, finally. Not a sellout, not a masterpiece, not a betrayal, not a salvation. Just a group of musicians, led by a genius who refused to play it safe, creating something nobody asked for and everyone needed. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And some stories, like Miles Davis's, change the way we hear everything that comes after.